Night rain had a way of whispering secrets in the city, rattling the windows of small shops and glittering on the glass towers that touched the clouds. On a narrow street that most drivers passed without noticing, a single dim yellow bulb glowed over a hand-painted sign, Nimra Tailoring and Repairs. Inside, the clock had already struck closing time, but the light refused to surrender. It was the kind of light that belonged to someone who still had work to finish, someone who could not afford to rest just because the world had decided it was late. Nimra's fingers moved with a quiet urgency, gliding through fabric as if she knew its memories. The suit jacket on her lap wasn't ordinary. The fabric felt like water and shadow woven together, impossibly smooth, impossibly expensive. She swallowed when she first touched it. Her own sweater had been darned 3 times at the elbow, but this jacket had probably cost more than her entire shop. The man who had brought it in had looked out of place on her street. His car had been black and silent, the kind that made neighbors peek through curtains. He wore a watch that didn't tick, it whispered. He said almost nothing, just placed the jacket on the counter, a torn seam barely visible unless you knew where to look. His voice had been deep and tired when he spoke. "I need it by tonight." He hadn't even asked the price. Nimra had looked at the jacket, then at his face. She had recognized something she knew too well: weight behind the eyes, the kind carried by people who could buy everything except peace. She didn't know who he was, though his face felt familiar, as if seen on billboards you never stopped to read. Billionaire or driver, she treated the same. Cloth in need of mending, hands willing to mend. As she stitched, her mind wandered to her mother sleeping in the room behind the shop, breath shallow, medicine bottles lined like sentries near the bed. The pharmacy had started refusing to give more until she paid the old balance. She had counted coins in the drawer that evening, but numbers didn't budge just because hearts did. She tied off the thread carefully, smoothing the seam so it disappeared without a scar. That was her gift, making broken things look as if they had never broken at all. When the doorbell tinkled softly behind her, the wind followed it in. He stood there again, raindrops on his shoulders, eyes surprised that the work was done so soon. She held up the jacket with both hands, as if returning something sacred. "It's ready," she said simply. He ran his fingers over the repaired seam, astonishment flickering across his expression, like someone who had expected competence but found perfection. "How much?" She hesitated. Her throat tightened. The number that could help with medicine sat heavily on her tongue. Instead, what came out was different, unplanned, almost reckless. "Nothing." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing through the paint on the walls, the cracked floor tiles, the tiredness in her smile. "Nothing." She shrugged, masking trembling with humor she didn't feel. It was just one stitch out of place. He held her gaze for a moment longer, something unreadable softening his features. He nodded once, slowly, as if making a decision he did not voice. Then he left, the bell chiming again, the night folding around him like a secret. The shop felt strangely empty without the suit, without his presence. She locked the door, turned the sign to closed, and leaned her forehead against the cool glass for a heartbeat. The streetlight buzzed. The rain slowed. Somewhere far away, sirens wailed then faded. She whispered a small prayer that tomorrow would not demand more than she had left. The next morning carried the fragile freshness that comes only after stormy nights. Sunlight pooled across the counter, catching every speck of dust in delicate gold nets. Nimra brushed her hair back, brewed tea that smelled faintly of cardamom, and swept the front of the shop. Routine was a comfort. Hang the tape measures, align spools of thread by shade, pretend that life could be organized like fabric. She had only fixed a tier, she told herself. People passed in and out every day. It meant nothing. Billionaire or baker, everyone left eventually. Between 2 paragraphs of silence, remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. A knock broke through her thoughts. It wasn't the gentle chime of her doorbell but a firm, deliberate sound, as if the knocker knew doors always opened for them. She froze, broom mid-air. The second knock came, heavier, impatient. She opened the door. 3 people stood outside. Dark suits, polished shoes, briefcases. Their expressions were precise, carved clean of all unnecessary emotion. The tallest of them stepped forward, and for one suspended moment the entire street seemed to lean in and listen. "Are you Miss Nimra?" he asked. Her name sounded strange in his mouth, official, legal, as if it had become part of a document. "Yes," she replied, voice thinner than she wanted. He reached into his briefcase. For a wild second she thought of unpaid bills, expired licenses, every small fear rising like startled birds in her chest. Paper rustled. He withdrew a folder stamped with a crest she didn't recognize but instinctively felt she should. "My client sent us," he said. "The billionaire. The jacket. The rain." Her heart stumbled. "We need to discuss," he continued, "a matter of considerable importance to you." She blinked. "To me?" Behind him, the street went on as usual, fruit seller calling out prices, a bus grumbling past, children arguing over marbles, yet everything felt shifted, as if the colors of morning had deepened. She stepped aside slowly, allowing them in, the bell chiming uncertainly as the door closed. The lawyers filled the small shop with their presence, paper and authority thickening the air. One of them glanced at the old sewing machine, the faded photographs on the wall, the curtain that guarded the small room where her mother slept. "What is this about?" she finally asked, trying to anchor herself to her own voice. The tallest lawyer opened the folder fully now, pages turning like wings. He looked up, his gaze steady, almost kind despite its sharpness. "It concerns the suit you repaired last night," he said. Her fingers tingled, as if they remembered the feel of the fabric. She thought of the tiny invisible seam, the choice she had made to ask for nothing. "What about it?" she whispered. He paused, measuring the moment, letting gravity gather between syllables. "The owner," he said, "was—" The words that followed hung unspoken in the charged air, right on the edge of revelation, while the tea on the counter cooled and the clock above them took a long, loud breath. "Involved in an incident last night," he finished, choosing his words carefully, each one placed like a chess piece. "And the timeline of events makes your involvement relevant." Nimra's mind raced ahead of his calm tone, tripping over possibilities. Accident. Crime. Scandal. She pictured flashing lights, crowds, the way cities wake up to rumors before they wake to sunlight. She swallowed, suddenly aware of her heartbeat in her throat. "I only stitched a seam," she said, hearing how small it sounded. "He came, he left. That's all." Another lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes softened by empathy, shook her head. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "that is not all." The tallest lawyer placed the folder on the counter, sliding a page toward her. A photograph. The man from last night, the one whose presence had carried quiet gravity, looking straight into a camera she would never see. The background was blurred, a world that bowed around him without ever touching him. His name was printed beneath it, bold letters, familiar in the way names become when they live on screens and in headlines. Amir Khalil. She drew a soft breath. She had seen that name before in newspapers folded behind tea stalls, in the murmurs of customers who used his company's internet, in stories of mergers, towers, charities too complicated to imagine. The kind of man who signed cities into existence. "He was found unconscious in his penthouse late last night," the lawyer continued. "No visible struggle. No forced entry. Paramedics arrived within minutes." Her mind leapt to the moment he had stood in her doorway, rain caught in his eyelashes, his voice worn. "Unconscious." The word echoed too loudly. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the question. "Alive," the lawyer replied. "In critical condition. Doctors are cautious." A pause, then, before he collapsed, he made a call. Nimra felt the room tilting slightly, like a boat nudged by a wave. "To whom?" she asked, though the answer trembled already in her chest. The lawyer's gaze didn't waver. "To this number." He slid another paper toward her. Her shop's landline number stared back, utterly ordinary, ink on paper, yet capable of rearranging mornings. "The call lasted 11 seconds, the woman lawyer added. "No words recorded. Just breath. Then silence." Nimra's hand drifted to the phone resting near the sewing machine, as if it were suddenly capable of remembering. She hadn't heard it ring. Or had she? The rain had been loud, the machine humming. 11 seconds could hide inside a storm. "We are trying to map his last movements precisely," the first lawyer said. "He visited your shop shortly before returning home. He made that call afterward. That makes this place significant." She stared at the worn counter, the mug rings, the stray thread, details that had never been more than background to survival. Significant. The word didn't belong here with cracked tiles and old calendars. "I didn't harm him," she whispered, then immediately hated that the sentence had needed to exist. "No one is accusing you," the woman replied gently. "If anything, you may be the last person who saw him conscious." That realization settled over her slowly, dense and undeniable. The last. The thought brushed something fragile inside her, the way endings do. "What did he say to you?" the lawyer asked. Nimra replayed their brief exchange in sharp, painful clarity. His tired eyes. Her reckless refusal of payment. The nod that had held something unspoken. "Very little," she admitted. "He asked how long it would take. He checked the seam when I finished. He looked as if he was carrying something heavy. Not in his hands. Inside." The lawyers exchanged glances, a silent language of professionals assembling puzzles faster than feelings could catch up. "Did he leave anything behind?" the tallest asked. "Object, paper, message?" She shook her head, but then hesitated. Memory flickered. When she had swept after closing, she had found something near the stool, a single silver cufflink engraved with an unfamiliar symbol. She had placed it in the small wooden box beneath the counter, intending to call in the morning, assuming he'd return. Her silence must have betrayed her. The woman leaned forward just slightly. "Miss Nimra?" "There was a cufflink," she confessed. "I thought he'd come back for it." 3 pairs of eyes sharpened at once. "May we see it?" the tallest asked. Her feet moved before fear could argue. She knelt, opened the box with hands that didn't quite feel like her own, and lifted the small piece of metal into light. It gleamed coldly, a curve of silver bearing a crest that echoed the one on their folder, but not exactly. Similar, yet altered, like a message within a message. The lawyer took it with gloved care, studying it closely. A breath escaped him, barely audible. "This design," he murmured to the others. "It's from the private foundation, not the corporation." Nimra knew nothing of foundations or boards, only that the object seemed to pulse with importance in the quiet shop. The woman lawyer turned it over, as though it could speak if tilted at the right angle. "Did he mention anyone?" she asked. "Any name, meeting, fear?" Nimra closed her eyes briefly. Something had passed across his face when she refused payment, surprise first, then something like relief touched by sorrow. A decision, she had thought. A conclusion. Or a beginning that felt like an end. "He looked as if he had already decided something," she said softly. "That's all." The clock on the wall ticked, loud enough now to mark every second as it fell into whatever this day was becoming. From behind the curtain, her mother coughed weakly, the sound that had always anchored Nimra in the present. The lawyer's eyes flicked toward the curtain, then back with a respect that did not intrude. "There is more," the tallest said, voice lowering. His legal team found an unsigned document in his study. A draft of an irrevocable directive. Your name appears in it. Her world narrowed to that single crushing sentence. "My name," she echoed, as if there might be another Nimra hidden somewhere in the file. "Yes," he said. "Full name. Spelled correctly." She could not imagine how a man like that would even know how to write her name, let alone anchor it inside something described with words like irrevocable. The shop, the broom, the teacups all suddenly seemed like props around a stage she had accidentally walked onto. What kind of directive? She forced herself to ask, even as part of her wanted to refuse the answer. "We don't yet know its final intent," the woman replied carefully. "It references the foundation, assets, and redress." It stops mid-sentence. Mid-sentence. As if he had been interrupted by collapse, by breath stolen halfway through shaping a future. "Why me?" she whispered, not to them but to the silence that had always listened without answering. No one responded at first. The question was too large, too premature, shaped from shadows. Outside, a motorcycle roared past, the world proceeding carelessly while hers twisted into knots. "We will need your cooperation," the tallest lawyer said, his tone shifting to procedure wrapped in kindness. "Protection may be advisable, depending on how this unfolds. Some individuals may have an interest in preventing this directive from being completed or discovered." The air turned colder at the edges of his words. Preventing. Interest. Individuals. The cufflink seemed suddenly heavier than steel, small enough to hide in a fist, large enough to reshape destinies. A car door slammed somewhere nearby. Nimra flinched despite herself. The lawyers noticed but pretended not to. Her mother coughed again, longer, the kind that scraped the lungs. Nimra's instincts surged. Protect the shop, the bed behind the curtain, the fragile normalcy that had always been enough until this morning decided it wasn't. "I need to check on my mother," she said, barely above a whisper. "Of course," the woman answered immediately. "We will wait." Nimra slipped behind the curtain into the small room where sunlight filtered onto faded blankets. Her mother's eyes opened slowly, searching her daughter's face with the unspoken question that lives between family members. "Are we safe?" Nimra took her hand, warm and frail beneath her fingers, and lied with a soft smile she had practiced through years of storms. When she returned to the shop, the lawyers stood quietly, their presence patient yet urgent, as if time itself had joined their team. A phone vibrated on the counter. Not hers. One of theirs. The tallest glanced at the screen, and everything in his expression tightened by an invisible thread. He listened for a few seconds, nodded once, and ended the call. He looked at Nimra, and the world seemed to hold its breath again. His voice had lost its professional polish. What remained was urgency stripped bare. "There's been a development," he said. Mr. Khalil regained consciousness for a brief window. It was minute-seconds, really. He attempted to communicate something before losing consciousness again. Every sound in the shop retreated. Even the faint traffic noise outside seemed to dim, as if the city itself leaned closer. "What did he say?" Nimra asked, the words scraping out of a throat gone dry. The lawyer's jaw tightened. "One word. Your name." It landed between them with the weight of something irreversible. Nimra felt it ripple through her hawk first, then confusion, then a strange trembling sense of being seen in a way she had never asked for. "He said Nimra," clearly, the woman lawyer confirmed softly. "Twice." She didn't know whether to sit or run. Something inside her recoiled from the spotlight suddenly blazing onto her quiet life, but another part felt unexpectedly steady, as if some thread beneath fear had already known this day was coming from the moment she tied off that invisible seam. "Why?" she whispered again, more to herself than anyone. "We don't know yet," the lawyer replied. "What we do know is this. When a man like him says a single name while hovering between consciousness and darkness, that name becomes significant to everyone around him. Everyone around him. Boardrooms. Rivals. Family. Strangers with power that moved like weather systems." She saw, in a flash of unwelcome imagination, doors opening and closing in glass towers because of a name scribbled into drafts and breathed into hospital air. The woman lawyer stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There is something else. His legal guardian until he recovers or is declared otherwise has already been activated. That puts pressure on whatever directive he was drafting. Some parties may want it honored. Others may not." The pieces began to assemble in Nimra's mind in stubborn fragments. A powerful man writing something he didn't finish. Her name in that unfinished thought. Lawyers arriving like storm clouds. A single silver cufflink, engraved with secrets. And now her name, spoken as the last thing he pushed into the world before slipping beneath it again. "What do you need from me right now?" she asked, surprising herself with how even her voice sounded, despite the chaos inside. "First," the tallest lawyer said, "we need you to tell us every detail, no matter how small, about your interaction with him. Exact words. Exact gestures. Anything you noticed that didn't make sense at the time. Second, we strongly recommend you avoid speaking to anyone else about this until we understand its scope." A small chill threaded down her spine. Anyone else? He held her gaze. Anyone. Journalists, strangers, acquaintances. Even some people who may claim to represent him. The warning didn't feel like paranoia. It felt like weather forecasted by people accustomed to storms. Nimra sank slowly onto the small wooden stool beside her sewing machine, as if her bones had finally admitted how much they were carrying. She described their encounter again, this time carefully, thread by thread, his silence, his weariness, the way he had touched the repaired seam with a gentleness that belonged to someone who rarely handled fragile things. She mentioned his hesitation before leaving, the way his eyes had lingered on her shop sign as though memorizing it. When she finished, the lawyers were quiet for several heartbeats, absorbing her words not as story but as evidence. The smallest of them, a younger man who had barely spoken, finally said, "He could have been trying to tell us where to find something, or who to trust. Or," the woman added, "who might be in danger." The word danger seemed to pull the light out of the room for an instant. Nimra straightened, instinctively glancing toward the curtain behind which her mother slept. The look did not escape them. "We will arrange protection if necessary," the tallest lawyer said immediately. "But first we must understand what we are protecting you from." A car slowed outside. Tires hissed against damp asphalt. A shadow paused beyond the frosted glass, then moved on. Nimra found herself listening to every passing footstep, every shift in the ambient soundscape, as if menace could be identified by the way it breathed. "What about the directive?" she asked. "Can it be completed?" "That is precisely what some will want to prevent," he answered. "If it confers power, or transfers assets, or exposes something, its incompleteness makes it both vulnerable and dangerous." The younger lawyer carefully placed the cufflink back on the counter. "This symbol connects him to the private foundation," he said. "That foundation deals mostly with restitution, reparations, undisclosed grants. Things not always made public. Restitution." The word snagged something deep in Nimra, like a hook brushing against an old scar. She thought of people standing in long lines with documents pressed to their chests, hoping for recognition of losses no one could really repay. She thought of debts that weren't made of money alone. "Does he owe me something?" she asked, amazed by her own audacity in voicing the thought. "We don't know," the woman said gently. "But it is unlikely this is random." A hush settled between them, thick with possibility. Nimra felt suddenly out of place inside her own life, as if she were wearing someone else's story that happened to be tailored in her size. A loud knock exploded against the door. All three lawyers turned in unison. Nimra's heart leaped against her ribs, wild and unrestrained. The knock came again, harder, rattling the glass enough to tremble the hanging scissors on the wall. The tallest lawyer motioned subtly for silence. He moved toward the door with measured steps and tilted his head just enough to see through the side panel. His expression changed not to relief, not to fear, but to controlled caution. He turned back to Nimra. "Do you normally receive visitors this early?" he asked in a low voice. "No," she breathed. The knock became a fist's command instead of a request. From behind the curtain, her mother stirred, half awake, sensing the disturbance like animals do approaching storms. Nimra raised a hand without realizing it, as though she could physically hold the world back for a second longer. The woman lawyer stepped to her side. "Whatever happens next," she murmured, "stay behind us." Paper rustled, leather creaked, and the lawyers positioned themselves without drama, a living wall between Nimra and the door. The tallest unlocked it and opened it only a fraction. A man's voice spilled through the gap, smooth and polite but with an edge of steel hidden beneath courtesy. "Good morning. We're here on behalf of the Khalil family." "Not legal team. Family." The lawyer at the door replied with equal politeness, yet firm boundaries. "This premises is currently under consultation with retained counsel. If you have business here, it should proceed through proper channels." "Of course," the stranger said. "But my instructions are to speak to the tailor directly. Miss Nimra." The syllables of her name, spoken by someone she had never met, slid across the floor and coiled around her throat. The lawyers exchanged swift glances, silent strategy again, and the tallest closed the door another inch. "Your instructions will be acknowledged," he said, "but not followed at this time." A pause outside. Then the faint scrape of shoes shifting position, more than one set. Nimra imagined men in coats, a dark car idling at the curb, windows tinted enough to reflect only sky. "Then please relay this message," the voice said, its politeness thinned to something sharper. "Miss Nimra's cooperation is expected. Delay would be unfortunate." Footsteps retreated. Engine murmurs rose and faded. The door remained closed, the shop suddenly too small for all the air inside it. The tallest lawyer locked it again and turned slowly. "That," he said, "accelerates our timetable." Nimra exhaled shakily, only now realizing she had been holding her breath since the first knock. The room felt different, same walls, same light, altered gravity. She saw the broom leaning against the counter and had the absurd thought that she had intended to sweep this morning, as though dust still mattered in a day like this. "What do I do?" she asked, because doing nothing felt impossible. "For now," he replied, "you stay close. You don't go anywhere alone. You answer nothing, sign nothing, promise nothing." And the phone on the counter rang. Not a vibration. Not a message tone. A ringing that sliced straight through their conversation, old-fashioned and insistent, as if it had clawed its way up from last night's 11 seconds and finally found its voice. The sound drilled into the room, shrill and unblinking, like a question that refused to wait its turn. Nobody moved for a heartbeat. The lawyers looked at the phone, then at each other, silently calculating possibilities. The ring continued, steady, almost patient in its insistence. Nimra felt pulled toward it, as if her name were wrapped around every pulse of sound. The tallest lawyer raised a hand, stopping her mid-step. "Put it on speaker," he said quietly. "And don't say your name." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the receiver. The plastic felt colder than it ever had before. She pressed the button, and the ringing died with a final click, replaced by a breath on the other end. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then a voice, low and roughened by exhaustion or emotion, slipped through the line. "Don't trust anyone." It was faint, strained, as if dragged up from somewhere deep and dark. Nimra's heart lurched. The cadence, the timbre, she knew it without ever having heard it over a phone. "Amir Khalil." A muffled sound followed, like a hand brushing against the receiver, then the voice again, urgent, frayed at the edges. "They're not who they say." A hiss of static swallowed the next words. "Cufflink, keep it safe." The line crackled violently, as if something or someone were trying to sever the thread of connection. The woman lawyer leaned closer, eyes wide, not blinking, memorizing every syllable as though they might evaporate if not held tight enough. "Foundation," the voice rasped. "Room behind." A sharp noise cut him off, not pain exactly, but interruption. Voices in the background, indistinct but commanding. A machine beeped somewhere near his breath. Then, softer, almost broken, "Nimra." "I'm sorry." The line went dead. Silence rushed back into the shop, but it wasn't empty. It was packed, swollen with everything he had said and everything he hadn't. "Don't trust anyone. Not who they say. Keep it safe. Room behind." The woman lawyer slowly exhaled. "That wasn't recorded through any official channel," she murmured. "This wasn't a hospital-sanctioned call." "He bypassed his guardianship controls," the younger one added, astonished despite himself. "He shouldn't have been able to place a call. But he had." "To her." The tallest lawyer looked at the phone, then at the cufflink on the counter, and then finally at the curtain leading to the back room. "He said room behind," he repeated thoughtfully. "Here? Or his residence?" Nimra's gaze followed his to the curtain, to the small private space that held her entire world, her mother's bed, the wooden chest, the old cupboard whose door had never closed properly. "Room behind." The words pulsed like a heartbeat. "I don't know," she whispered. "This is the only room behind I have." The lawyer nodded once. "Then we start here." They didn't touch anything at first. They simply looked. The lawyers moved with the careful respect of people stepping into someone's life rather than someone's house. The woman paused beside the small shelf of folded shawls, the younger man near the cracked window. Nimra knelt beside the old wooden chest automatically, opening it just enough to reveal what she had always kept there: spare blankets, wrapped memories, the kind of belongings that have more value in stories than in numbers. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Her mother watched them with clouded curiosity, sensing seriousness but not the shape of it. Nimra squeezed her hand gently. "Just checking something," she whispered, though her own voice sounded far away even to herself. "May I?" the tallest lawyer asked, gesturing toward the cupboard. She nodded. He opened it. Clothes hung meekly, colors faded by years of light and washing. At the bottom, shoes were stacked with the quiet dignity of being needed. He ran his hand lightly along the inside panel, not searching violently, just feeling for anything that did not belong. His hand stopped. He leaned closer. There, carved into the inner wood where no one would casually notice, was a tiny symbol. The same curved design as the cufflink, almost hidden, etched lightly as if someone hadn't wanted it to be seen unless someone else knew to look. Nimra stared, confused. That wasn't there." "How long have you had this cupboard?" he asked. "Years. It was my grandmother's. She brought it from the village before I was born." The lawyers exchanged glances that carried entire conversations. Legacy. History. Foundation. Restitution. The woman traced the symbol with the tip of her finger, reverent and alarmed at once. "This mark is older than last night," she said. "Much older." Nimra's mind spiraled through half-remembered stories from childhood, about land disputes, about papers lost in floods, about promises that floated away when those who made them died. She saw her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and sure, tying threads, mending things because no one else would. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The younger lawyer looked almost reluctant to answer. "It may mean," he said slowly, "that your family has been connected to the foundation for a long time. Not as beneficiaries only. Possibly as something central." Central. The word didn't fit her, didn't belong to a tailor who measured cloth in inches and survival in days. And yet it sat there, immovable, like a chair placed suddenly in the middle of a small room. The woman leaned in closer, brow furrowed. "This is a registry mark," she explained gently. "Used decades ago to identify families with unresolved claims or sealed agreements. Most records were digitized later, but some were lost." A cold realization crept through Nimrah, settling into her bones like frost. "Then the directive," she whispered, "wasn't random. He knew." The tallest lawyer nodded. "He knew something about you, or your lineage, that intersects with that foundation. Which means what he was drafting may have been an attempt to rectify something old. Something contested. Old debts. Lost land. Broken promises that linger for generations like ghosts nobody sees but everyone feels." Her mother's fingers tightened unexpectedly around hers. Nimrah turned. The old woman's eyes had cleared, not fully, but enough to hold a thin thread of awareness. She swallowed, then spoke with the effort of lifting a stone. "Your grandfather," she murmured, "always said, 'Papers will return. One day someone will come with our name written correctly.'" The words fell like keys into locks no one had opened in years. Nimrah's throat closed. She had heard those stories as a child, then folded them away under practical concerns: rent, medicine, seams that needed fixing. She had never expected them to knock back into her life with lawyers and billionaires attached. A car passed slowly outside, then another. Voices drifted faintly in the distance. The shop suddenly felt like the center of a map no one had shown her yet. The phone vibrated again, this time the woman lawyer's. She glanced at the screen, her composure wobbling for the first time. "They've sealed the hospital floor," she said. "Access restricted. Family only." "Family is the guardianship," the younger lawyer muttered. "Which means information will narrow quickly." Nimrah looked at the cupboard symbol, the cufflink on the counter, the quiet fierceness in her mother's eyes as though something old inside her had finally recognized its cue. "Don't trust anyone," the billionaire had said. She understood now that he hadn't meant the world in general. He had meant specific people who had something to lose if old promises were honored and old papers resurfaced. The tallest lawyer straightened, decision settling into his posture like weight distributed evenly. "We need to secure this place," he said. "And whatever this cupboard connects to, we have to find it before anyone else does." A shadow moved past the shop window, slow enough to be deliberate. Another knock came. Softer than before, but somehow far more dangerous. The knock was almost polite, 2 measured taps, as if whoever stood outside already knew they would be let in sooner or later. The lawyers stilled again, listening the way animals listen before deciding whether to run or fight. Nimrah felt the air in the room change shape, becoming thinner, stretched. Her mother's hand tightened on hers once more, insistent, fragile but urgent. Nimrah bent closer. The old woman's voice was barely more than a breath. "Don't open," she whispered, with a certainty that came from somewhere older than fear. Then she closed her eyes again, exhausted by the effort of speaking. The tallest lawyer raised his finger in a silent signal, then moved to the door with caution sharpened to precision. He did not open it. He didn't even touch the handle. Instead, he stood to the side, using the narrow edge of the frosted glass to catch a distorted silhouette outside. A figure waited. Not shifting, not impatient. waiting the way people wait when they are accustomed to doors opening because they knocked. Another knock. Same softness. Same confidence. The woman lawyer's voice was a whisper. They're not leaving without trying something. Or someone, the younger lawyer added. The tallest lawyer finally spoke, not loudly enough to carry clearly through the door, but loud enough that the presence outside would know they were acknowledged. This business is closed. Please return another time. The reply came almost instantly. A woman's voice, calm and warm the way a blanket is warm before you realize it's also heavy. I'm not here for business. I'm here for family. The three lawyers exchanged a sharp glance. Family. The word slid beneath the door like mist. Nimrah felt it brush against her thoughts, searching for a place to anchor itself. I believe, the voice continued, Miss Nimrah's grandmother owned this cupboard. The room seemed to shrink around the cupboard at the back, as if the wood itself had heard its name. Nimrah's heart stumbled. She looked at the lawyers. How could someone outside know about that? The symbol had just been discovered minutes ago. The woman lawyer shook her head slightly, warning in her eyes. The tallest one stayed silent. The voice outside, still gentle, added, We just want to talk. If you don't open the door, others will come who don't ask. Nimrah felt something move inside her. Not trust, not recognition, but the familiar sensation of being cornered by circumstances too large. She swallowed and stayed where she was. The tallest lawyer didn't open the door. He asked, Who are you? A pause. The reply arrived unadorned. Someone who has been waiting for that symbol to resurface for 33 years. Silence pressed in. 33 years was older than Nimrah. Older than most of the shop's cracks. Older than the story she thought her life was made of. The woman outside sighed softly. I know you're afraid, she said, and though the words weren't addressed directly, they found Nimrah like arrows anyway. But fear won't stop this anymore. It's already moving. The sound of retreating footsteps followed, not hurried, not defeated. Just steps leaving a message behind them like a scent trail. A car engine didn't start. No door slammed. Whoever it was had arrived on foot and left the same way. The lawyers waited another long minute before anyone moved. The youngest broke the silence. They knew the cupboard, he said. They knew the mark. We've lost the advantage of secrecy. The tallest lawyer locked the door again with deliberate clarity. Then we move faster. He turned to Nimrah. There is something you need to consider seriously now. We cannot guarantee your safety here much longer. We can relocate you, discreetly, while we continue this work. Nimrah looked around her shop at the spools of thread, the window with its faded sign, the stool where children had sat, watching their school uniforms be rescued by her hands. Everything felt like a piece of her body. Leaving it felt like leaving herself in parts on the floor. My mother, she said simply. We would move her with you, the woman lawyer promised instantly. Medical arrangements can be made. Her mother coughed in the next breath, as if to remind the world that decisions like this were not theoretical. Nimrah brushed back the curtain again, smoothing the blankets, murmuring reassurances she barely believed. When she returned, her eyes had changed. Not harder, clearer. We don't move yet, she said. Not until I understand what they want from me. The tallest lawyer regarded her for a moment, then nodded once, not in agreement but in respect. Then we'll make this place safer for the time being. He didn't elaborate. He made 3 calls in quick, low sentences that revealed nothing but arrangements being set into motion. The woman lawyer closed the blinds halfway. The younger one checked the back window latch. Their movements were efficient but not frantic. They were used to this crisis that unfolded like long shadows, step by step. Nimrah went to the cupboard again, unable not to. She touched the carved symbol. It felt no different to her fingers, just faint grooves in old wood, but her mind crowded with possibilities until breathing required effort. Her grandmother's face floated back in her memory, tired, lined, forever busy hands and eyes that sometimes drifted far away, into fields Nimrah had never seen. She remembered one night in childhood, when storms cracked the sky and lantern light painted shadows on the walls. Her grandmother had whispered a prayer into the cupboard before closing it. Not a prayer for protection. A promise. Nimrah suddenly knelt and felt along the base of the cupboard, where met dust and quiet secrets could live for decades without being disturbed. Her fingers slid beneath the lower shelf, expecting nothing. They touched paper. Thin, brittle, folded upon itself so many times it had learned to be small. Her breath fled her as if pushed. "There's something here," she said, not loudly, not triumphantly, just truthfully. The lawyers converged without stepping on her moment. She eased the paper out slowly, afraid it might tear, afraid it might vanish like a dream if handled wrong. The document emerged inch by inch, yellowed, edges frayed, but astonishingly intact. The woman lawyer took one look and drew in a sharp breath she tried to hide. "It's stamped," she said. A faded seal clung to the lower corner, the same crest family as the cufflink but older, heavier, printed with ink that had once been bright and now lived in twilight. The text was cramped, crowded lines of legal language and names that seemed suddenly unfamiliar even to Nimrah's own eyes. Her family name was there. Not alone. Paired with another. Khalil. Everything inside her seemed to tilt at once, like furniture in a room whose floor had just slanted under earthquake tremors. She stared, unable to blink. Her fingers curled unconsciously, as if trying to hold on to reality before it slipped. The younger lawyer leaned closer, reading rapidly. "This is a land settlement," he said slowly. "Joint custodianship. Transfer upon condition. It was never executed." The tallest lawyer finished the thought. "Which means it was frozen. Legally alive, practically dead." The paper named property Nimrah had never seen, described boundaries in old terms: canal, banyan tree. The road before it had a number. It referenced a dispute, a promise of restitution, signatures half complete, a witness line left empty. Khalil. Her family. A bridge grown out of ink, unwalked for 3 decades. Nimrah struggled to speak, but her voice emerged hoarse. "So my grandfather and his?" "His father," the woman lawyer supplied softly. "Amir's father." The implications cascaded silently. A promise made between 2 men, suspended in time, waiting for someone to unearth it in a tailor's cupboard decades later. Amir drafting a directive. A cufflink bearing the same crest. A phone call threaded with apologies meant for someone who had inherited a story she didn't know she was in. The tall lawyer's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it, and his face turned grim. "We don't have much time. Word is spreading faster than we thought. The family's private security is mobilizing. So is the board. Board. Family. Security. Forces that moved buildings and governments, now adjusting their focus onto a narrow street and a small shop with dangling threads." Nimrah held the fragile document as if it might shatter or burn. She understood now, with terrifying clarity, that the past had been waiting for the moment she stitched a billionaire's coat without taking money. Not as transaction, as signal. As recognition. Her mother stirred again and whispered through cracked lips, "Your grandfather said they would say it's too late." But paper doesn't forget. Outside, a car slowed to a stop. Not fast. Not loud. Just there. The car door closed with a muted thud, and the sudden quiet wrapped around the shop like a blanket that was just a bit too heavy to breathe under. Hira stood very still, listening to the echo of the engine fading down the lane, her hands resting on the counter as if she needed its solidity to keep from swaying. The name kept circling in her head like a moth fluttering against a lamp. Arman Halim. She had heard it in passing on television when the electricity was kind enough to stay, on the radio when the dial was just right. She had heard it from customers, spoken with awe or envy. But now it hung in the room like a secret she had accidentally touched. She looked around at her shop, at the patched-up shelves, the old iron with its worn cord, the jars of buttons that rattled every time a truck passed by outside. It all looked smaller than before, as though the presence of that name had caused the space to shrink. She pressed her palms together and whispered a small prayer she had learned as a child, not because she knew what to ask for, but because silence felt too loud. Then she remembered the suit. The immaculate fabric, the nearly invisible mend, the way she had worked with a strange, trembling care as though the cloth itself could feel. The chime over the door tinkled, and she startled. A woman from the neighborhood stepped inside with her usual chatter about hems and loose threads, and Hira forced herself back into the rhythm of the day, nodding and measuring and marking. She did not mention the visitor. She didn't know why, but it felt like a secret that had not yet chosen to be shared. Outside, life went on. A bicycle bell rang, children argued about marbles, a seller called out about fresh fruit. It should have grounded her, but everything instead felt distant, happening far away from the tiny point she stood on. That evening, when she closed her shop, she double-checked the lock as if danger were suddenly more real. The narrow alley looked the same, but now every passing shadow seemed to carry meaning. She walked home with her worn bag against her chest, the way she always did, yet tonight she was aware of the rhythm of her own steps, counting them in her head to keep herself from drowning in thoughts. The bulb outside her door flickered, and she paused for a heartbeat before pushing it open. Her mother was asleep on the cot, her breathing shallow and steady. The medicine bottle stood on the stool beside her, its label curling at the edges. Hira tucked the blanket around her and sat down on the floor, drawing her knees up to her chest. The day stretched out in her mind like an unwound thread, and at the very end of it was his quiet voice, his unexpected gratitude. She smiled without realizing she had, then quickly wiped it away, as if happiness were something someone might take back if they saw it. She did not sleep easily that night. Her dreams were a jumble of pins and fabric, of doors opening and footsteps approaching. Once she woke thinking she had heard knocking, but the silence of the small house assured her she had not. The clock on the wall ticked, each sound like a drop of water falling into a deep well. She turned over and closed her eyes again, unaware of how close morning already was. When dawn finally pried the darkness off the sky, she rose with the slow stiffness of someone who had argued with sleep all night. She brewed tea, the steam fogging the cracked window, and listened to the familiar morning sounds of her neighborhood waking up. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary again. She told herself it was just one customer among hundreds, that names were only words, that nothing ever really changed for people like her. She almost believed it. By the time she reached the shop, she had rehearsed a normal smile in case anyone asked why she looked distracted. She swept the floor, arranged the pins into neat rows, and opened the shutters fully to welcome whatever the day chose to bring. Yet beneath the movement of her hands there was a quiet expectation she could neither name nor dismiss. She kept glancing at the doorway, annoyed with herself for doing so, telling herself that people like him did not return, not to places like this. Hours passed. Customers came and went, leaving the faint scent of their perfumes or the dust of the road behind. The sun climbed, then softened, painting the counter with streaks of gold. Hira began to relax, to feel slightly foolish for the way her heart leaped at every unfamiliar sound. She sat down behind the sewing machine and pressed her foot to the pedal, letting the hum of the needle work its way through her bones, soothing her like a lullaby she had known her entire life. Then the sound came. It wasn't the sound of a bicycle or a vendor's cart. It was a deeper, smoother hum, the kind she had only heard on the main road, far from alleys like hers. It grew louder, then stopped abruptly. A shadow passed across the front of her shop, blocking the afternoon light for a fraction of a second, and all the tiny hairs on her arms rose at once. She froze, thread suspended between her fingers, needle poised mid-stitch. The chime over the door did not tinkle this time. Instead, the door opened slowly, deliberately, as if whoever was entering was accustomed to spaces making room for them. Two tall figures stepped inside, their shoes shining in a way that almost seemed out of place on her cracked tiles. Their faces were calm, unreadable, like people who carried news that didn't belong to them personally. They scanned the room with professional precision, their gaze finally settling on her. Her throat went dry. She tried to stand, found that her knees resisted, then finally managed to push the chair back and rise. For a strange moment she thought of dust on shelves and the frayed edge of the curtain and wished suddenly that she had polished everything, prepared somehow for this moment she had never imagined. One of them spoke, his voice measured, practiced, carrying the faint metallic ring of authority. He asked her name, and when she said it, her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere just beside her, not from her own mouth. He nodded as though ticking off a box she could not see. He mentioned the name she had whispered in her prayers the night before, the name that still buzzed in the corners of her mind, and everything around her seemed to still. Her heart started to beat so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Outside, someone laughed, unaware of the weight pressing down inside the little shop. The other man opened a leather folder, revealing neat stacks of papers, embossed seals that caught the light like small, trapped suns. He began to speak, the words sliding into the room one by one, each carrying consequences she could not yet grasp. Hira glanced at the suit she had fixed, folded carefully in the back room waiting to be collected, and for the first time realized that her life might have shifted the moment she touched its hem. She stood very still, hands clasped tightly, listening as those carefully chosen words continued, and something unknown and unstoppable began to unfold right in front of her. Night had fallen like velvet over the city by the time everything finally came full circle, and the lights in the tall buildings glimmered like distant constellations Hira never imagined would spell her name. The events of the past days had unfolded so swiftly that she sometimes wondered if she'd simply fallen asleep at her sewing table and dreamt an impossible dream. But the soft weight of the contract in her bag, the glow of her mother's eyes, and the gentle ache in her chest told her this was real, astonishingly, breathtakingly real. The day the lawyers had returned for the last time, the air in her tiny shop felt different, reverent even, as if the walls themselves were aware that life was about to change shape. They carried not just documents, but decisions, paths that diverged like threads waiting to be chosen. And at the center of it all stood Hira, the poor tailor girl whose world used to be bound by pins, hems, and the sound of an aging sewing machine. She had once believed destiny belonged to the powerful, that fate listened only to those who spoke loudly in rooms where she would never be invited. But Arman Halim had walked into her life with a torn seam, and somehow, in that delicate space where fabric meets needle, two lives had been stitched together by something invisible and fierce. His gratitude had grown into respect, and respect had become something deeper, something that recognized the quiet dignity in her struggle and the unyielding strength beneath her modest smile. When she visited the hospital where her mother lay resting, with better care than she had ever dreamed of affording, she held her mother's frail hand and felt time pause. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, not of fear or exhaustion, but of a gratitude so vast it seemed to rise and fall with each breath. Her mother opened her eyes, the cloudiness replaced by a clarity that came not from medicine alone, but from the relief of watching her daughter finally step beyond survival and into possibility. No words were spoken for a while. They didn't need to be. Their silence was full, like a prayer completed. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the miracle unfolding in that small room. Arman stood by the window, his suit immaculate, his posture strong, yet there was a softness in his expression that few people were allowed to see. He looked at Hira as someone looks at a sunrise they never expected to witness. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by wealth, by people who measured value in numbers and deals, and yet here was this woman who measured it in kindness, in the patience of her hands and the courage of her heart. In fixing his suit without asking for anything, she had repaired something much deeper inside him, something he had long ignored. The new tailoring academy opened in a building that once intimidated her to even walk past. Its glass doors reflected her image back at her, no longer only the poor tailor of the alley, but the founder, the mentor, the symbol of transformation. The ribbon-cutting ceremony, filled with cameras, curious eyes, and murmured admiration, felt surreal. Yet the truest moment happened when the first group of shy young women stepped inside, touching the tables as though they were stepping into a sacred place. Their lives, just like hers had been, were threaded with scarcity, sacrifice, and unspoken dreams. And now, in this place born of a single generous act, they would learn to stitch their futures with their own hands. She walked through the classrooms, the hum of new machines harmonizing like a promise. On one desk lay a scrap of fabric, the edges rough, waiting to be shaped. She ran her fingers across it and smiled, remembering how her journey had begun with scraps too. Bits of cloth, bits of hope, bits of faith carefully pieced together. Armin watched her from a short distance, not interfering, recognizing that this was her moment, not his. He had given resources, support, and doors once closed, but she had given the vision, the heart, the very soul of this creation. Word of the tailor who changed fate spread farther than she could have guessed. Customers came not only for stitching now, but for stories, for inspiration, for the quiet lesson that kindness is not weakness and humility is not invisibility. She accepted attention with grace, always returning in her thoughts to the first small shop in the narrow alley, where dust had lived on shelves and yet dreams had secretly waited on the windowsill. That shop was still there, untouched by glamour, and she visited it often. She would unlock the door and step into its familiar scent of cloth and oil, feeling like she was greeting an old friend who had watched every tear, every prayer, every sleepless night. She never removed the old sewing machine. She never polished away the scratches on the counter. They were her history, the proof that greatness doesn't begin with applause. It begins in silence, in perseverance, in choosing integrity when nobody is watching. One evening, the sky turned amber and violet as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, and she sat alone in that old shop, listening to the whisper of the wind through the cracked window-pane. She thought of the first day he had walked in, carrying his expensive suit and a weight she had not yet understood. She thought of how she had refused payment, not expecting anything, just following the quiet compass of her heart. A single decision, so small at the time, had rippled outward until it became a tide that lifted not just her life but the lives of many. Armin entered quietly, the bell chiming like a memory. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, taking in the modest walls that had held the beginning of their story. There was no grandness here, no shining marble floors, yet there was a warmth no mansion could replicate. He joined her near the counter, their shoulders almost touching, and they watched the final light melt into night. He told her what she already sensed, that the free stitching of his suit had been the greatest gift he had ever received, not because of the cloth restored, but because through that gesture he had rediscovered humanity unswayed by power. In giving without asking, she had reminded him what it meant to have enough and still choose generosity. He had once been a man surrounded but alone. She had been alone, but surrounded by love she continued to give even when little remained. The city lights flickered awake, like thousands of tiny witnesses to this quiet exchange. Cars moved, people rushed, stories unfolded in distant windows. And inside this humble shop, something extraordinary settled into place. Not shouted, not celebrated with fireworks, but felt deeply, with the certainty that some meetings are written long before footsteps ever cross. Hera closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in the soft air of the room that had held her beginnings and endings. She realized then that the story was not about wealth and poverty, or even about a billionaire and a tailor. It was about threads, how they cross, how they tangle, how they can break or hold together entire worlds. It was about the unseen hands of fate that guide two people from opposite sides of life into one small space where everything changes quietly. And in that realization was the magnificence, the truth that greatness can walk into your life disguised as an ordinary day, that a simple act of compassion can open doors no key could ever unlock, and that sometimes the smallest stitch you make ends up mending the largest tear in the fabric of someone's heart.